As I sat there in my carefully decorated backyard, watching everyone open their gifts while my mother-in-law Linda smiled her knowing smile, I realized that sometimes the cruelest gifts aren't the ones you don't receive. They're the ones that show you exactly where you stand. 3 weeks earlier, I had been filled with such hope. After 5 years of marriage into the prestigious Anderson family, I thought my 30th birthday party would finally be the moment everything changed. Standing in my kitchen that spring morning, I drafted the guest list with trembling fingers, determined to make this celebration different from all our previous family gatherings. My mother-in-law Linda's voice echoed in my head from our last interaction. "Darling, turning 30 is significant for an Anderson wife. It's when we truly embrace our role in society." The way she'd emphasized society made it clear she didn't consider my current role, teaching English at a public high school, to be suitable for someone bearing the Anderson name. But this time would be different. I'd spent months planning every detail, carefully weaving together elements that would bridge the gap between my middle-class background and the Andersons' old money world. The venue would be our recently renovated Craftsman Home's backyard, casual enough to make my family comfortable but elegant enough to meet Linda's exacting standards. The catering menu reflected this balance, locally sourced gourmet appetizers alongside comfort food classics, each dish chosen to tell the story of who I was and who I was trying to become. The centerpiece would be a hand-painted watercolor cake, combining Linda's love of traditional elegance with my appreciation for artistic expression. My husband Derek supported my vision, though I caught the concern in his eyes when I showed him the elaborate plans. "Emma, you don't have to try so hard," he said gently. "My family should accept you for who you are." But I wanted more than acceptance. I wanted to belong, to transform from the scholarship girl who married the golden boy into someone worthy of the Anderson name. Someone Linda would proudly introduce at her charity galas instead of vaguely referring to as Derek's wife who does something with children. As I finalized the guest list, carefully balancing my boisterous relatives with the Andersons' reserved social circle, I imagined Linda finally seeing me differently. She would realize that I could maintain their standards while staying true to myself. My birthday would become the moment she finally welcomed me as a true daughter, not just an obligation. I spent hours crafting the perfect invitation, choosing paper thick enough to impress Linda, but with a design creative enough to reflect my personality. Each envelope was addressed in careful calligraphy, a skill I'd practiced for weeks after Linda mentioned that proper ladies never used printed labels. When I dropped the invitations at the post office, my hand lingered on Linda's envelope. Inside was more than just an invitation. It was a peace offering, a bridge between our worlds, a chance to finally prove I could be the Anderson wife she wanted while remaining true to myself. What I didn't realize then was that sometimes the bridges we try to build end up revealing the chasms that can never be crossed. As I watched that envelope disappear into the mail slot, I was full of hope for the perfect celebration that would change everything. I had no way of knowing that my 30th birthday would indeed change everything, just not in the way I had planned. Looking back now, I can see how that hope, that desperate desire to belong, had slowly been chipping away at who I really was. But sometimes we need to lose ourselves completely before we can find our true strength. And my 30th birthday party would turn out to be exactly the gift I needed, just not the one I was expecting. The morning of my 30th birthday dawned with Seattle's signature misty rain coating everything in a pearl-like sheen. I'd been awake since 4, watching raindrops trace patterns on our bedroom window, my mind racing through the countless details of the day ahead. The weather forecast promised clearing skies by afternoon, one small mercy in what already felt like a high-stakes performance. Our Craftsman house, nestled in one of Seattle's older neighborhoods, stood as a testament to the compromises in my marriage. Derek had wanted a modern penthouse downtown, closer to his law firm, but I'd fallen in love with this house's character, its imperfect charm. Linda had called it quaint when we bought it, her way of saying it was beneath an Anderson status. But over 3 years, we'd transformed it into something special, blending historic details with contemporary touches. The backyard, where the party would be held, had been my passion project. I'd spent countless weekends creating an outdoor space that could rival any country club garden, though on a more intimate scale. Raised flower beds burst with carefully tended blooms, their colors selected to complement the stone patio we'd installed last summer. The ancient maple tree, which Linda had once suggested we remove, now anchored a seating area that would soon hold 30 guests. As I made my way downstairs, each step felt weighted with significance. The catering team would arrive in 2 hours. The rental company had delivered the tables and chairs yesterday, elegant wooden pieces that cost more than my monthly teaching salary, but met Linda's standards for appropriate outdoor furniture. Everything had to be perfect. In the kitchen, I found a note from Derek propped against the coffee maker. "Happy birthday, beautiful. Don't stress too much today. You're amazing just as you are. Gone for a quick run, back soon. Love you." His thoughtfulness made my throat tight with emotion. If only his mother could see me through his eyes. The kitchen itself reflected the day's carefully orchestrated fusion of worlds. Gleaming professional appliances, a wedding gift from the Andersons, shared space with my grandmother's well-loved cast-iron skillets. The marble countertops, Linda's influence, were currently covered with my mother's handwritten recipe cards as I double-checked the menu with the catering company. My phone buzzed, a text from my sister Rachel. "Happy birthday, sis. Don't let the Ice Queen get to you today. Remember you're a Carter before you're an Anderson." I smiled at her protectiveness. Rachel had never hidden her disdain for Linda's treatment of me, but she'd promised to be on her best behavior today. The guest list was a delicate balancing act. From my side, my parents, Tom and Mary Carter, Rachel, and a handful of close friends who'd known me since before I became Mrs. Anderson. From Derek's side, his parents, Linda and Robert, his brother, James and wife Catherine, 3 sets of aunts and uncles, and various family friends whose social connections Linda deemed essential. The sound of car tires on wet gravel drew me to the window. The catering van had arrived early, a small blessing that quickly turned into a new source of anxiety as I realized the china cabinet needed to be unlocked. Linda had insisted we use the family's heirloom serving pieces, stored in an antique cabinet she'd gifted us after deeming my own dishes unsuitable for entertaining. As I searched for the key, memories of past family gatherings flooded back. The first dinner party I'd hosted as Derek's wife, where Linda had corrected my table settings in front of everyone. The Christmas where she'd rearranged my decorations, while I was in the kitchen. The countless subtle ways she'd made it clear that being married to her son didn't make me one of them. The cabinet key was in Linda's designated drawer in the kitchen. Yes, she had her own drawer, insisted upon for emergency hostessing supplies. Inside, alongside the key, lay a handwritten guide to proper Anderson entertainment etiquette. I'd memorized every rule, hoping that perfect compliance would finally earn her approval. Outside, the catering team waited patiently as I fumbled with the lock. Through the window, I could see the rain beginning to ease, patches of blue sky, breaking through the clouds. The head chef, a woman I'd chosen specifically because her fusion cuisine might impress Linda while still feeling authentic to me, offered a reassuring smile. "Everything will be perfect, Mrs. Anderson," she said as I finally got the cabinet open. "We'll make sure of it." Mrs. Anderson. Even after 5 years, the name still sometimes felt like a costume I was wearing rather than my identity. Today, surrounded by the physical manifestation of my efforts to bridge 2 worlds, that feeling was stronger than ever. I watched the catering team begin their careful choreography of preparation, each movement bringing me closer to the moment that would either finally cement my place in the Anderson family or... I pushed away the alternative. Today would be different. It had to be. What I didn't know then was that perfection wouldn't save me. that all my careful planning and desperate attempts to please would lead to a moment of truth I never saw coming. But as I stood in my kitchen, surrounded by the trappings of two different lives trying to merge into one, that realization was still hours away. The next 3 hours passed in a whirlwind of activity. Derek returned from his run to find the house transformed into what he jokingly called Command Central. The catering team had taken over the kitchen, the florist was arranging centerpieces in the dining room, and I was supervising the setup of the outdoor tent, a last-minute addition to guard against Seattle's unpredictable weather. "The tent company only had white?" Derek asked, noting my furrowed brow as I watched the workers secure the supports. "Mom specifically recommended ivory." "They're bringing ivory panels to drape inside," I explained, checking my meticulously detailed schedule. "Linda called them personally to ensure they understood the difference between mere white and proper ivory." The memory of that conversation, Linda's thinly veiled suggestion that I couldn't distinguish between shades, still stung. The doorbell chimed, announcing the arrival of the cake. This was perhaps the most crucial element of all, a 3-tiered masterpiece from Seattle's most exclusive bakery. The design had gone through 5 iterations before Linda approved it, each change accompanied by a lecture on the importance of maintaining standards. As the cake was carefully positioned on its designated table, my phone buzzed with a text from Catherine, Derek's sister-in-law. "Linda's having her hair done at Bergman's. Says she'll arrive precisely at 2. Deep breaths, Emma." I smiled at Catherine's warning. In the 5 years I'd been married to Derek, Catherine had become an unexpected ally, having gone through her own initiation into the Anderson family. The sound of breaking glass shattered my thoughts. One of the catering staff had dropped a champagne flute, one of Linda's precious heirloom crystal pieces. The young server looked terrified, probably having been warned about the significance of these family treasures. "It's okay," I assured her, already moving to help clean up. "Accidents happen." "But Mrs. Anderson, your mother-in-law, she was very specific about—" the server stammered. "I'll handle Linda," I said with more confidence than I felt. In truth, I could already hear her voice. "Emma, darling, perhaps next time we should consider hiring staff more accustomed to handling fine crystal." Derek appeared with the dustpan crouching beside me. "We could always say James did it," he whispered, referring to his brother. "Mom never scolds her precious firstborn." His attempt at humor helped ease the tension, but we both knew Linda would somehow know. She always knew when things weren't perfect. Like the time she'd noticed a single water spot on a spoon at Christmas dinner, or the barely visible crease in the tablecloth at Easter brunch. The next crisis came in the form of the gift table. The event planner, recommended by Linda, of course, insisted it needed to be positioned differently than we'd planned. Mrs. Anderson Sr. was very particular about the sightlines. She explained, rearranging the display I'd spent an hour perfecting. I watched as my carefully curated design was dismantled and reconstructed according to Linda's specifications. Each gift would be displayed based on the giver's social status. Another unwritten Anderson rule I'd learned the hard way. "Your family's gifts can go on the side table," the planner said diplomatically, gesturing to a smaller surface partially hidden by a floral arrangement. The implied hierarchy wasn't subtle. My mother's handmade quilt, weeks in the making, would be relegated to that secondary table. The thought made my chest tight, but I said nothing. Today wasn't the day to challenge the natural order of things. Today was about harmony, about finally proving I could be the daughter-in-law Linda wanted. As the afternoon progressed, I changed into my carefully selected outfit, a designer dress that had cost 3 months of teaching salary, but met Linda's standards for appropriate birthday attire. The pale blue shade had been chosen to complement both the party's color scheme and the sapphire pendant Derek had given me on our first anniversary, one of the few pieces of jewelry Linda had ever complimented. Standing before the mirror, I practiced my smile, the one I'd wear when Linda inevitably made one of her backhanded compliments. You look so much more sophisticated than usual, dear. What a lovely effort you've made. I'd learned to accept these remarks with grace, to find the hidden compliments within the criticism. The final touch was a light application of the expensive perfume Linda had given me last Christmas, with the suggestion that it was more suited to an Anderson wife than my usual scent. Every detail had been considered, every possible criticism anticipated and addressed. A knock at the bedroom door revealed Derek, looking handsome in his tailored suit. "Mom just called," he said, his expression careful. "She wanted to remind us about the gift-giving ceremony. Says it needs to follow proper protocol." The gift-giving ceremony, another Anderson tradition I'd had to learn. Gifts would be presented in a specific order, with Linda orchestrating the proceedings like a conductor leading a symphony. I'd witnessed it at other family celebrations, seen how she used it to reinforce the social hierarchy she held so dear. What I didn't know then, as I made these final preparations, was that this ceremony would become the backdrop for a moment that would shatter everything I thought I knew about family, acceptance, and my place in the Anderson world. But for now, I simply nodded, checked my reflection one last time, and prepared to play my part in what I hoped would be the perfect celebration. The stage was set. The players were preparing to take their positions. And somewhere across the city, Linda was putting the finishing touches on a plan of her own, one that would turn my carefully orchestrated party into something none of us expected. The first guests began arriving at 1:30, 30 minutes earlier than the invitation specified, exactly as Linda had predicted. The truly well-bred always arrive early enough to be seated properly, but not so early as to inconvenience the hostess, she'd lectured during one of our many guidance sessions. Today, I was grateful for that particular lesson as I welcomed Derek's Aunt Patricia and Uncle William. Something in Aunt Patricia's expression set off the first warning bell. Her eyes darted around the setup with an unusual intensity, her practiced social smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Linda mentioned you were planning something different," she said, emphasizing the last word in a way that made it sound like a diagnosis. Uncle William headed straight for the bar, but not before I caught his murmured comment to his wife. "Well, she certainly spent Anderson money on this." The word sent a chill down my spine. Had Linda been discussing my party? Preparations with the family? My parents arrived next, my mother clutching her handmade quilt with nervous fingers. "Emma, sweetheart," she whispered as she hugged me. "Maybe we should keep this for later, at home." She'd clearly picked up on the formality of the setting, the careful orchestration that left no room for heartfelt homemade gifts. "No, Mom," I insisted, taking the quilt and placing it on the designated family gift table. "It's beautiful, and I'm proud to have it here." But even as I said the words, I noticed Derek's cousin Charlotte watching the exchange with barely concealed amusement. The next red flag came in the form of James, Derek's brother, arriving without Catherine. "She's picking up Mom," he explained, not quite meeting my eyes. They had some last-minute details to discuss. The phrase last-minute details echoed ominously in my mind. In Anderson speak, that usually meant plans were being modified without my input. More guests filtered in, creating distinct social clusters in the backyard. My side huddled near the comfort food station, while the Andersons gravitated toward the champagne and canapes. The invisible line between the two groups might as well have been drawn in chalk on the pristine lawn. Derek's cousin Margot, always eager to curry favor with Linda, cornered me by the gift table. "The setup is interesting," she mused, adjusting a ribbon on her elaborately wrapped present. "Though I'm surprised you didn't go with Linda's suggestion about the traditional Anderson birthday protocol." "Traditional protocol?" I kept my voice steady, though my heart had started racing. "Linda approved all the arrangements." "Oh?" Margot's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose. "That's not what she was saying at the club yesterday, but I'm sure it will all work out. Somehow." She drifted away, leaving me with a growing sense of dread. I found Derek deep in conversation with his father's business partner. "Can I borrow you for a minute?" I interrupted, forcing a smile. In the kitchen, I relayed the concerning comments I'd been hearing. Derek ran a hand through his hair, a nervous habit he'd never quite overcome. "I'm sure it's nothing, Em. You know how they love their gossip." But there was something in his expression, a flicker of worry he couldn't quite hide. "Derek," I pressed, "did Linda say something to you about the party?" He hesitated just a fraction too long. "She might have called yesterday while you were at school. She was just asking about the gift-giving ceremony, making sure we understood the proper order. And suggesting that maybe we should have let her handle more of the arrangements. She mentioned something about maintaining certain standards for milestone birthdays in the family." Before I could respond, Rachel appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Em, you need to come see this." Her voice carried an urgency that made my stomach drop. In the backyard, the catering staff was rearranging everything, from the position of the tables to the order of the gift display. Standing in the center of this whirlwind of activity was Catherine, looking apologetic but determined. "I'm so sorry, Emma," she said quietly as I approached. "Linda insisted. She says it needs to be done properly for the ceremony. She'll be here any minute." "Sure. Enough." A sleek black Mercedes was pulling up to the curb. Through the tinted windows, I could make out Linda's distinctive silhouette. But instead of her usual prompt entrance, she remained in the car, phone pressed to her ear, obviously orchestrating something. The sun emerged from behind a cloud, illuminating the garden in harsh clarity. Everything I'd so carefully planned was being systematically dismantled and reconstructed according to some protocol I hadn't been privy to. And Linda hadn't even stepped foot in the party yet. I caught my reflection in one of the decorative mirrors I'd placed around the garden. The confident hostess I'd hoped to be was already giving way to the uncertain daughter-in-law I'd been trying to outgrow. And somewhere deep inside, a small voice whispered that this was just the beginning, that Linda's extended car conversation was the calm before a storm I wasn't prepared to weather. Just then, my phone buzzed with a text from one of Derek's aunts who hadn't yet arrived. "Looking forward to Linda's special presentation during the ceremony. So thoughtful of her to organize it." Special presentation? My heart sank. Whatever. Linda had planned. It was clear that everyone except me had been briefed on their roles. As I watched her finally emerge from her car, resplendent in designer wear and wearing her signature satisfied smile, I realized that my perfect party was about to become something else entirely. A stage for whatever performance Linda had orchestrated. Linda's entrance was a masterclass in calculated timing. She paused at the garden gate, allowing everyone to notice her arrival while pretending not to notice them noticing. Her designer dress, a shade of blue that made my carefully chosen outfit look suddenly pedestrian, caught the afternoon light perfectly. She'd planned this moment down to the angle of the sun. "Emma, darling," she called out, her voice carrying across the garden with practiced precision. As I approached, she air-kissed my cheeks, her perfume overwhelming my senses. 30. Such an important milestone. Though I must say, the setup is quite different from what we discussed. Different? I managed to keep my voice steady. "I followed all your suggestions, Linda." "Did you?" Her eyes swept the garden, cataloging every detail that had survived her remote reorganization. "I suppose you interpreted them in your own, unique way. But never mind that now. Robert, dear, the gifts need rearranging before the ceremony." My father-in-law dutifully began moving presents according to some predetermined plan, while Linda circulated among the guests. She stopped at each cluster, whispering something that caused them to glance in my direction with expressions ranging from pity to barely concealed anticipation. Mom seems extra focused on the gift arrangement, Derek murmured, appearing at my side. Should I ask her what's going on? Before I could respond, Linda's voice rang out again. Derek, darling, could you help your father? Some of these packages are quite heavy, and they need to be in very specific positions. She emphasized the word specific while looking directly at me. I watched as Derek joined his father, noticing how some gifts were being prominently displayed while others, mainly those from my side of the family, were being subtly shifted to less visible positions. My mother's quilt had somehow ended, up almost completely hidden behind larger packages. Catherine approached, clutching her wineglass like a shield. Emma, I tried to warn you, she whispered. Linda's been planning this for weeks. She has this whole idea about proper milestone celebrations and family traditions. What exactly has she been planning? I asked, but Catherine was already being summoned away by Linda's imperious wave. The catering staff, now taking direction exclusively from Linda, began rearranging the food presentations. My carefully planned fusion of comfort food and elegant hors d'oeuvres was being dismantled, with certain dishes disappearing entirely into the kitchen. We can't have chicken wings at an Anderson celebration, I overheard Linda explaining to my mother, her tone dripping with condescension. I'm sure you understand, dear. It's about maintaining certain standards. My mother's face flushed as she retreated to where my father stood, looking increasingly uncomfortable in his rented suit. Rachel, watching from nearby, took a step forward, but I caught her eye and shook my head slightly. Creating a scene would only prove Linda's point about our family's lack of proper breeding. The tent, which had been set up according to my specifications, was now being modified under Linda's direction. The sight lines were all wrong, she announced to no one in particular. Really, Emma, you must learn to consider these things. Social gatherings are about creating the proper atmosphere for meaningful interactions. Each change felt like a small cut, precise and deliberate. Linda moved through the space like a conductor, orchestrating not just the physical arrangements but the social dynamics as well. She managed to separate my friends from school into their own corner, effectively isolating them from the important conversations happening among the Anderson social circle. Linda, I finally spoke up as she began instructing the bartender. To remove certain wine bottles I'd specifically chosen, I did research all the traditional protocols you mentioned. I have your notes right here. I reached for my planning folder, but she waved it away. Oh, those were just preliminary thoughts, dear. The true Anderson traditions require a more experienced hand. But don't worry, I've taken care of everything. Her smile was beatific, but her eyes held a challenge. After all, this is your first milestone birthday as an Anderson wife. We must ensure it's done properly. The word properly hung in the air like a verdict. Around us, the party continued to transform, each change stripping away another layer of my careful planning. Even the music had been changed, my curated playlist replaced by classical selections that Linda deemed more appropriate. Through it all, I maintained my composure, smiling and nodding as 5 years of effort to bridge two worlds was systematically dismantled. But inside, something was shifting. Each small correction, each subtle criticism, each whispered comment was building toward a realization I wasn't quite ready to face. The sun was beginning to lower in the sky when Linda gathered everyone's attention once again. "Shall we begin the gift-giving ceremony?" she announced. "I've taken the liberty of arranging everything according to proper protocol." She paused. Her next words aimed directly at me, though she addressed the entire gathering. After all, some traditions simply must be respected. As the guests began taking their assigned seats, another detail Linda had apparently orchestrated without my knowledge, I caught sight of my reflection in one of the decorative mirrors. The woman looking back at me seemed to be fading somehow, becoming transparent under the weight of Linda's orchestrations. What I didn't realize was that in the next hour, that fading woman would either disappear completely or finally find her. Voice. The stage was set for Linda's carefully planned performance, and I was about to discover exactly what role she had cast me in. The seating arrangement for the gift-giving ceremony resembled a small amphitheater, with chairs arranged in a semicircle facing the elaborately displayed gift table. Linda had positioned herself at what could only be described as the command center, a slightly elevated spot that gave her a perfect view of both the proceedings and the guests' reactions. "Emma, dear," she called out, patting the chair next to her. "The birthday girl sits here, of course. Derek, you'll be on her other side." Her tone made it clear this wasn't a suggestion, but a stage direction in her carefully choreographed production. As I made my way to my assigned seat, I tried to catch Derek's eye, but he was engaged in conversation with his brother James. The guests were settling into their places according to some invisible hierarchy that everyone but me seemed to understand. "Before we begin," Linda announced, her voice carrying that particular tone that demanded attention, "I thought we might start with a few words about the significance of a milestone birthday in the Anderson family." She produced an elegant leather-bound book that I'd never seen before. "This is the Anderson family record," she explained to the gathering, though her eyes fixed pointedly on me. "It contains the history of all significant family celebrations, including the traditional protocols that have guided us for generations." My stomach tightened as she opened the book with ceremonial precision. I noticed Catherine shifting uncomfortably in her seat, while several of the Anderson relatives leaned forward with anticipant expressions. "For instance," Linda continued, "did you know that in 1892, when Elizabeth Anderson celebrated her 30th birthday, she received the family sapphire collection? Of course, that was after she had proven herself a worthy custodian of the Anderson legacy." The emphasis on worthy wasn't subtle. I felt the weight of every guest's gaze, particularly those from Derek's extended family. My own family, relegated to the outer edges of the seating arrangement, looked increasingly uncomfortable. "Mom," Derek interjected, "perhaps we could move on to the actual gift-giving?" His attempt to redirect the proceedings only seemed to fuel Linda's determination. "Patience, darling. Understanding our history is crucial for those who wish to truly become part of the family." She turned another page in the book. Now, in 1923, when Margaret Anderson reached this milestone, I used this moment to scan the faces around me, trying to gauge the room. My sister Rachel was practically vibrating with contained anger. My mother had that pinched expression she got when trying not to cry. Meanwhile, Derek's Aunt Patricia was nodding along with Linda's every word, occasionally shooting me evaluating glances. The historical lecture continued, each example seemingly chosen to highlight the qualities Linda found lacking in me. Stories of Anderson wives who had hosted legendary social gatherings, who had chaired important charity committees, who had, in Linda's words, understood their role in maintaining the family's social position. I maintained my composed smile, years of practice keeping my expression pleasant even as my internal temperature rose. A light breeze stirred the tense ivory panels, providing momentary relief from the suffocating atmosphere. "And now," Linda finally concluded, closing the book with a definitive snap, "we come to today's celebration. As you all know, the gift-giving ceremony in our family follows a specific order, designed to honor our traditions and relationships." She gestured to Robert, who began distributing small cards to the Anderson family members. I caught glimpses of handwritten numbers. Apparently, everyone had been assigned their moment in Linda's carefully orchestrated performance. Should we be getting numbers too?" my sister Rachel asked, her voice carrying more edge than strictly necessary. Several Anderson relatives turned to stare at her as if she'd committed a terrible faux pas. "Oh," Linda smiled, the expression not reaching her eyes. "The family gift-giving has its own special section. We'll get to that, dear." The dismissal. In her tone was clear, causing Rachel to flush deeply. Derek's hand found mine under the carefully arranged folds of my dress. A gesture of support, but also a warning. I could feel the tension in his grip, silently pleading with me to maintain the peace. The sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the garden. The carefully strung lights began to twinkle in the approaching dusk, creating an almost theatrical atmosphere. Everything was illuminated perfectly for Linda's production. "Now then," she announced, lifting an elegantly wrapped package from its prominent position. "Let us begin with the first presentation. This gift represents not just a material offering, but a symbol of what it means to be a true Anderson." As she stood, preparing to begin her performance, I caught sight of my reflection in one of the decorative mirrors Linda had repositioned. The woman looking back at me seemed to be asking a question. How much longer would I allow myself to be a silent actor in someone else's play? What happened next would answer that question in ways none of us expected, least of all Linda. The gift-giving ceremony began with an unexpected moment of warmth. Robert, my father-in-law, stepped forward with his assigned package, but instead of following Linda's scripted introduction, he went off book. "Emma," he said, his voice gentler than I'd ever heard it. "When Derek first brought you home, I remember thinking how your smile lit up the room. You reminded me of my own mother, not because of any social standing or family connections, but because of your genuine heart." Linda's carefully composed expression flickered for just a moment. This clearly wasn't part of her planned protocol. Robert continued, seemingly oblivious to his wife's growing discomfort. "This gift," he held up an antique wooden box, "belonged to my mother. She was a teacher too before she married into the Anderson family. Not many people know that." He gave me a conspiratorial wink that caused several gasps among the older relatives. As I opened the box, I found a beautiful vintage fountain pen, along with a collection of handwritten letters. "These are her teaching journals," Robert explained. "I thought you might appreciate them more than anyone else in the family." The moment felt genuine, touching. Several guests murmured appreciatively, and I noticed some of the tension in the atmosphere beginning to dissolve. Even some of the more staunch Anderson relatives were smiling. "How unexpected," Linda managed, quickly consulting her ceremony schedule. "Though perhaps we should move on to the more traditional presentations." But James, Derek's brother, was already stepping forward. "Actually, Mom, Catherine and I would like to go next." He exchanged a meaningful look with his wife, who joined him carrying their gift. "Emma," Catherine began, her voice steady despite Linda's sharp gaze, "we wanted to acknowledge not just your birthday but the way you've enriched our family." She handed me a large flat package. Inside was a professionally framed photograph, one Catherine had taken at last year's charity gala. It captured a moment I'd forgotten about, when I'd abandoned the formal dinner to help one of the catering staff's children with their homework in the kitchen. The image showed me sitting on a prep counter, explaining math problems to the young boy, both of us oblivious to the expensive gala happening beyond the kitchen doors. "You taught me," Catherine continued, her voice growing stronger. "That real class isn't about following protocols or maintaining appearances. It's about how you treat people when you think no one's watching." The atmosphere in the garden shifted again. Several guests were dabbing at their eyes, and I noticed some of the younger Anderson cousins nodding in agreement. My own family members sat straighter, pride evident in their postures. Linda's fingers drummed against her leather-bound book. "Yes, well, that's lovely, though perhaps not quite in keeping with the traditional spirit of the ceremony." She attempted to regain control of the proceedings, but the momentum had shifted. Derek's cousin Charlotte, who I'd always thought of as Linda's protégée, surprised everyone by speaking up. "Actually, Aunt Linda, I think this is exactly what these ceremonies should be about. Connection, not just convention." For a moment, it seemed as though the careful walls Linda had constructed were beginning to crumble. The rigid seating arrangement had relaxed, with guests shifting to better see each presentation. Even the invisible line between my family and the Andersons had begun to blur. My mother, encouraged by the changing atmosphere, retrieved her quilt from its hidden position. "Maybe it would be all right if I shared this now?" she asked, looking not at Linda but at the gathering as a whole. Before Linda could object, several guests called out in encouragement. The quilt was unfurled, revealing its stunning craftsmanship. Each panel told a story: my first day of teaching, Derek's and my wedding, moments that wove together both families' histories. "This is exquisite work," Derek's Aunt Patricia remarked, running her fingers over the detailed stitching. "You must tell me how you achieved these effects." As my mother began explaining her quilting techniques to an increasingly interested group of Anderson women, I caught Derek's eye. He was beaming, clearly thrilled at this unexpected harmony. Even Linda seemed momentarily at a loss, watching as her carefully orchestrated ceremony transformed into something more organic, more genuine. For a brief, shining moment, I allowed myself to hope that perhaps this was the breakthrough I'd been dreaming of. But then I noticed Linda's expression shifting from confusion to determination. She stood, smoothing her designer dress with deliberate movements. "While this has been interesting," she announced, her voice cutting through the warm atmosphere like a frost, "we must maintain proper order. After all, I haven't presented my gift yet." The sudden chill in her tone caused the conversations to fade. The genuine warmth that had been building dissipated like morning mist under a harsh sun. As Linda moved to retrieve something from behind her chair, I saw Catherine and James exchange worried glances. Whatever was coming, their expressions told me, would make the previous tension seem like a gentle breeze before a storm. The moment of comfort had been just that, a moment, and a false one at that. Linda's heels clicked against the stone patio as she walked to the center of our makeshift amphitheater. The sound reminded me of a metronome, counting down to something inevitable. She had positioned herself perfectly. The setting sun behind her created an almost theatrical backlight, while the garden lights illuminated her face with calculated precision. "Before I present my gift," she began, her voice carrying that particular resonance she reserved for important pronouncements, "I believe we need to address the true significance of this occasion." She opened her leather-bound book once again, but this time pulled out what appeared to be old photographs. The first photo she held up showed a young woman, probably in her early 30s, dressed in what must have been the height of fashion several decades ago. "This," Linda announced, "is Margaret Anderson on her 30th birthday. The day she fully embraced her role as keeper of the Anderson legacy." Derek shifted uncomfortably beside me. I felt his hand squeeze mine, a gesture that seemed equal, parts support and anxiety. Around us, the atmosphere had changed. The earlier warmth completely evaporated, replaced by a heavy anticipation. "Margaret understood," Linda continued, producing another photograph, "that being an Anderson means more than just carrying the name. It means upholding certain standards, maintaining specific traditions." Her eyes fixed on me. "It means knowing your place." Catherine attempted to intervene. "Linda, perhaps we could—" "Not now, dear," Linda cut her off smoothly. "This is important. Emma needs to understand what's expected of her." She placed the photographs on a small side table, arranging them with deliberate precision. After all, some of us have made accommodations for the sake of family harmony. The word accommodations hung in the air like smoke, acrid and choking. I watched as she retrieved something else from behind her chair, a large, flat box wrapped in expensive-looking paper. "I've been saving this for the right moment," Linda explained, running her fingers along the box's edges. "A teaching moment, you might say." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Since Emma is so fond of teaching." Several of the Anderson relatives leaned forward in their seats, clearly aware of what was coming. I noticed Aunt Patricia whispering excitedly to Uncle William, while Cousin Charlotte was practically bouncing with anticipation. Rachel started to stand, but my father placed a restraining hand on her arm. The divide between our families, temporarily bridged during the earlier gift-giving, had reasserted itself with stark clarity. You see, Linda's voice took on a lecturing tone. Becoming an Anderson wife isn't just about marriage. It's about transformation, about leaving behind certain elements that might not quite meet our standards. She paused, allowing her words to sink in. Some people understand this naturally. Others need more direct guidance. The sun had almost completely set now, and the garden lights cast strange shadows across Linda's face. She looked almost theatrical, like an actress reaching the climax of a long-rehearsed performance. "Mom," Derek started, but Linda silenced him with a look. "Patience, darling. This is for Emma's own good." She adjusted her position slightly, ensuring all eyes were on her. I've watched for 5 years as she tried to straddle two worlds, maintaining her teaching career while attempting to fulfill her duties as an Anderson wife, trying to blend her background with our traditions. Each word was carefully chosen, each pause calculated for maximum impact. I felt the weight of every guest's attention, heard the slight intake of breath from those who knew what was coming. "The time has come," Linda declared, lifting the box with ceremonial gravity, "to make a choice, to understand what it truly means to be part of this family." The garden had fallen completely silent. Even the usual evening sounds, birds, distant traffic, the gentle fountain, seemed muted, as if nature itself was holding its breath. James and Catherine exchanged worried glances. Robert had gone very still, his earlier warmth replaced by a rigid discomfort. Derek's grip on my hand had tightened to the point of pain. Linda stepped closer, the box held out like an offering, or a verdict. "So, Emma dear," her voice dripped with false sweetness, "shall we see what it takes to become a real Anderson?" The moment stretched like a wire pulled too tight, ready to snap. In the tense silence, I could hear my own heartbeat, could feel the eyes of every guest, both Anderson and Carter, fixed on me. Whatever was in that box, whatever Linda had planned, would be more than just a birthday gift. It would be a proclamation, a judgment, a line drawn in the sand between who I was and who she thought I should be. The garden lights flickered, almost uncertainly, as Linda prepared to deliver what she clearly believed would be the defining moment of the evening. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this moment would indeed be defining, just not in the way she intended. Linda placed the box in my lap with theatrical precision, her movements choreographed for maximum effect. "Open it, dear," she instructed, her voice carrying across the now silent garden. "Everyone is waiting to see your transformation." The box was surprisingly heavy, wrapped in imported paper that probably cost more than my weekly teaching salary. As I carefully removed the wrapping, conscious of every eye upon me, I could hear the slight rustle of anticipation from the gathered guests. Inside was a leather portfolio, embossed with the Anderson family crest. Linda beamed triumphantly as I lifted it out. "Go on," she urged. "Open it." The first page revealed a formal letter of resignation, already typed up on my school's letterhead. My hands began to tremble as I read the carefully crafted words. "I hereby tender my resignation as English teacher, effective immediately, to pursue my duties as a full-time Anderson wife. I took the liberty of drafting it for you," Linda announced to the gathering. "Your principal, an old family friend, has already been consulted. He understands completely, of course. After all, it's time you embraced your real role in society." The portfolio contained more documents, applications for various charity board positions, all pre-filled with my information. A schedule of social obligations extending months into the future. even a memo detailing appropriate topics of conversation for Anderson women at social functions. "This is your gift," Linda declared proudly. "Freedom from the burden of working for a living. Freedom to become who you were meant to be." She turned to address the guests. "I remember when Margaret Anderson did the same for me, helping me understand that my little piano performances weren't suitable for an Anderson wife." The silence in the garden was deafening. I could feel Derek's tension beside me, see Catherine's horrified expression, hear my sister Rachel's barely contained gasp of outrage. "Well?" Linda prompted, clearly expecting grateful tears or humble acceptance. "Isn't this what you've been working toward? Being a true Anderson?" I looked down at the resignation letter again, seeing my entire identity reduced to a few dismissive paragraphs. 5 years of trying to fit in, of bending and compromising, crystallized in this moment of absolute clarity. "No," I said quietly. Linda's triumphant smile faltered. "I beg your pardon?" I said no. My voice grew stronger as I stood, still holding the portfolio. "No to this resignation. No to erasing who I am. No to becoming another perfectly polished trophy in your collection." "Emma." Linda's tone held a warning. "You're making a scene. This isn't how we handle things in our family." "Your family?" I felt something breaking free inside me, not breaking down, but breaking through. "Let me tell you about family, Linda. Family is my students staying after school for extra help because they trust me. It's my mother spending months making a quilt you tried to hide. It's my sister wanting to defend me even when I won't defend myself." I opened the portfolio again, this time holding it up for everyone to see. "This isn't a gift. It's a cage. A beautifully gilded, socially acceptable cage, but a cage nonetheless." The garden lights seemed to grow brighter as I continued, illuminating every face in stark clarity. "You want to talk about transformations? Let's talk about how you transformed from a talented pianist into someone who polices other women's lives. Let's talk about how you tried to transform Catherine from a passionate photographer into a silent accessory. Let's talk about how you've spent 5 years trying to transform me into something I'm not." Linda's face had gone pale, her perfect composure cracking. "How dare you? After everything we've done for you, everything you've done to me," I corrected. "Every criticism, every subtle dig, every backhanded compliment, all designed to make me feel small, to make me doubt myself, to make me grateful for the chance to disappear into your version of what a woman should be." I turned to the gathered guests, seeing shock, admiration, and recognition on various faces. Look at us all sitting here letting one woman dictate how we should live, what we should value, who we should be. Why? Because of some family name? Some social status? The portfolio fell to the ground with a satisfying thud. I'm proud to be a teacher. I'm proud of my background. I'm proud of who I am. And if that's not good enough for the Anderson family, then maybe it's not me who needs to transform. Derek stood beside me, taking my hand. "She's right, Mom. This ends now." Linda looked around desperately for support, but found only uncomfortable silence or outright agreement. Even her staunchest allies seemed to be seeing her, really seeing her, for the first time. "You can't," she began, but her voice had lost its authority. This isn't how it's supposed to go." "No," I agreed softly. "It's not how it's supposed to go. It's how it needs to go. For all of us." The garden fell silent again, but this time it was different. It was the silence of change, of walls crumbling, of truth finally spoken aloud. As I stood there, still holding Derek's hand, I realized that Linda had indeed given me a gift tonight, just not the one she intended. She had given me the gift of clarity, of finding my voice, of finally understanding that the only transformation worth making is into a truer version of yourself. In the wake of my outburst, the garden descended into chaos. Guests began speaking all at once, years of carefully maintained silence finally breaking. But it was Robert who commanded everyone's attention when he slowly walked to the center of the gathering. "Linda," he said, his voice heavy with something that sounded like regret. "Show them the other photograph." Linda's head snapped up. "Robert, don't." "The one you keep in your desk drawer. The one from before we were married." Linda's hands trembled as she clutched her leather-bound book. "This isn't the time." "It's exactly the time," Robert insisted. He turned to address the gathering. "You all know Linda as the perfect Anderson wife, the keeper of traditions. But none of you knew her before. None of you saw her perform." Catherine leaned forward. "Perform?" Robert nodded, his eyes never leaving his wife. "Linda wasn't just a piano player, as she so dismissively puts it now. She was a prodigy, set to debut at Carnegie Hall the month after our wedding." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Linda's face had gone completely white, her perfect composure shattered. "I have the photograph," she whispered, reaching into her book with shaking hands. The image she withdrew showed a younger version of herself, seated at a grand piano on a concert stage, her face alive with passion and joy. "What happened?" I asked softly, though I was beginning to understand. "Margaret Anderson happened," Robert answered when Linda remained silent. "My mother made it clear that no Anderson wife could pursue such a public career. It wasn't suitable. So Linda gave it up, transformed herself into what my mother wanted. And you let her?" Derek's voice cracked with emotion. "I was a coward," Robert admitted. "I watched the woman I loved disappear piece by piece, replaced by this perfect society wife. And then I watched her do the same thing to Catherine, and now she's trying to do it to Emma." Linda suddenly stood, the photograph falling from her hands. "You don't understand. Any of you. I did what I had to do, what was expected, what was right." "Right for whom?" Catherine challenged. "For you? For the family? Or for a dead woman's outdated ideas about what women should be?" "I gave up everything." Linda's voice rose, decades of suppressed emotion breaking through. "My music, my dreams, my identity. All of it. And for what? To become exactly what Margaret wanted, the perfect Anderson wife, the keeper of traditions, the guardian of the family name." She turned to me, her eyes wild with a pain I'd never seen before. "And you? You waltz in here with your teaching career and your independence and your refusal to conform. Do you know what that does to me? Watching you fight for everything I gave up?" The truth of it hit me like a physical force. Linda's cruelty hadn't stemmed from simple snobbery or social ambition. It came from a deeper, more painful place, watching another woman refuse to make the sacrifices she had made, refuse to disappear as she had disappeared. Every time you walk into a family gathering talking about your students, your projects, your passion for teaching, Linda continued, her voice breaking, it's like looking into a mirror of what I could have been, what I should have been brave enough to be. The garden light seemed to soften, casting Linda in a different light, not as the imperious mother-in-law, but as a woman who had lost herself so completely she could only find purpose in forcing others to follow the same path. "I thought," she faltered, looking around at the shocked faces of her family, "I thought I was helping you, protecting you from the pain of not fitting in, the whispers, the judgment, the constant pressure to be perfect." Robert stepped forward, reaching for his wife's hand. "Linda, my darling, you became exactly what my mother wanted. But in doing so, you became what you most feared, another Margaret Anderson, crushing other women's dreams in the name of tradition." The silence that followed was profound. Even the garden seemed to hold its breath as Linda slowly sank back into her chair, the weight of revelation evident in every line of her body. "I'm so tired," she whispered. And for the first time, I saw the real Linda, not the perfect Anderson wife, but a wounded woman who had spent decades building walls to protect herself from her own lost dreams. Derek still held my hand, but his other hand reached out to his mother. "It's not too late, Mom. The piano. Your music." Linda looked up, tears streaming down her perfectly made-up face. "But what would people think? Who cares?" Catherine's voice rang out clear and strong. "Let them think. Let them talk. Let them judge. We're done living in Margaret Anderson's shadow." As the truth of Linda's past filled the garden like evening mist, I realized that this moment wasn't just about my liberation. It was about all of us breaking free from the chains of expectations we'd either accepted or fought against. The perfect Anderson wife had cracked open to reveal the wounded artist within, and in that revelation lay the possibility of healing not just for Linda, but for the entire family. The evening air grew thick with unspoken words as Linda dabbed at her tears with a monogrammed handkerchief. The perfect tableau she had orchestrated lay in ruins around us, the carefully arranged chairs now askew, the precise gift display scattered, her leather-bound book of traditions abandoned on the ground. "I want to see you play," I said suddenly, breaking the tense silence. All heads turned toward me. Not the perfect Anderson wife, not the keeper of traditions. I want to see the woman in that photograph. Linda's eyes widened. "Now? But this is your birthday celebration." "Yes, now." I walked to the French doors leading into our living room, where my upright piano sat. It wasn't a concert grand, but it would serve. "Show us who you really are, Linda, not who Margaret Anderson wanted you to be." "Emma's right," Catherine added, standing up. "Enough hiding, enough pretending, enough forcing everyone else to live behind the same masks you wore." Linda looked around frantically, perhaps seeking an ally in maintaining the old order. But the carefully constructed hierarchy had crumbled. Even her staunchest supporters among the family looked at her with new eyes, waiting to see what she would do. "I haven't played in public for 30 years, she whispered, her voice small and uncertain. "Then it's about time," Robert said gently, offering his hand. The woman I fell in love with wasn't afraid to share her passion with the world. The guests began to move inside, drawn by the possibility of witnessing something authentic finally breaking through the polished Anderson veneer. My parents, who had been silent observers of the drama, helped rearrange the living room to create a performance space. Linda sat at the piano, her perfect posture now looking less like social training and more like a musician's habit. Her fingers hovered over the keys, trembling slightly. "What if I've lost it?" she asked, vulnerability raw in her voice. "What if I've forgotten how to be her?" "Then we'll be here while you remember," Derek said firmly. The support in his voice seemed to surprise Linda as much as her earlier revelations had surprised us. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Linda's fingers touched the keys, and the opening notes of Chopin's Nocturne in B-flat minor filled the room. It was hesitant at first, like a bird testing its wings after years in a cage. But as she played, something remarkable happened. The rigid set of her shoulders softened. The practiced society smile melted away. The woman at the piano was neither the perfect Anderson wife nor the wounded artist. She was something new, something real, emerging from decades of carefully maintained artifice. The music swelled, filling every corner of the room with raw emotion. I watched in amazement as Linda's face transformed, years of careful control falling away with each passionate phrase. When the final notes faded, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Linda remained at the piano, her hands still on the keys, as if afraid to break the spell. "Why?" I asked into the silence. "Why did you let them take this from you?" She turned to face me, Her makeup smeared, but her eyes clearer than I'd ever seen them. Because I was afraid. Afraid of losing everything. Position, respect, security. Margaret made it clear that I had to choose. My music, or my place in society. And now? Catherine pressed. What are you afraid of now? Of admitting I made the wrong choice, Linda's voice cracked. Of facing all the years I've wasted trying to turn other women into what I became. Of acknowledging that I've been the very thing I most despised. I moved to stand beside the piano. You have a choice. Now, Linda, you can keep forcing everyone into Margaret Anderson's mold, or you can help us break it. Show your granddaughters that they don't have to choose between their passions and their family name. But the traditions, she began weakly. Make new ones, Rachel interjected, speaking up for the first time. Traditions that celebrate who we are instead of forcing us to become something we're not. Linda's eyes swept the room, taking in the faces of her family, not just the Andersons, but the Carters too. The carefully maintained boundaries between our families seemed to have dissolved in the wake of her music. I've been so cruel to you, she said, looking directly at me. To all of you, trying to make you small enough to fit into the box I've lived in for so long. Then let's break the box, I replied. Together, starting now. The confrontation that had begun with her attempt to force me into submission had transformed into something else entirely. A chance for healing, for change, for authentic connection. Linda stood from the piano, squaring her shoulders not with her usual social armor, but with newfound purpose. The gift-giving ceremony, she announced, her voice carrying across the room. We're going to do it again, but this time we'll do it honestly. No protocols, no hierarchy, no pretense. It wasn't an apology in words, but it was a beginning. A step toward something real, something true, something that might actually bring our families together instead of forcing one to submit to the other's standards. The night was far from over, but the worst of the storm had passed, leaving in its wake the possibility of something new growing from the ruins of what had been broken. As the guests settled back into the garden for the renewed gift-giving ceremony, I found myself hanging back, watching the scene with new eyes. The carefully constructed facade had cracked, revealing something raw and real beneath. In that moment of quiet observation, everything I thought I knew about belonging began to shift. For 5 years, I'd believed that fitting into the Anderson family meant becoming someone else. I'd cataloged every criticism, internalized every subtle correction, modified my behavior in countless small ways. But watching Linda at the piano had shown me something profound. The price of that kind of transformation wasn't just high, it was devastating. I walked to the edge of the garden, where the string lights cast gentle shadows on the flowers. I'd so carefully chosen to match Anderson tastes rather than my own preferences. My mother approached, carrying 2 glasses of champagne. "You're a million miles away," she said softly, handing me a glass. "I was just thinking about my first day teaching," I replied, surprising myself with the memory. How terrified I was of failing, of not being good enough. But the moment I started actually teaching, everything else fell away. I was just me. "I remember," she smiled. "You called me that evening, so excited you could barely get the words out. That was the real you, passionate, energetic, full of purpose. When did I start believing that wasn't enough?" The question hung in the air between us. In the background, I could hear Linda talking with Catherine about photography, their voices carrying a new warmth of genuine interest rather than social necessity. "You know what I realize now?" I continued, watching the interaction. "I've spent so much time trying to prove I deserve to be an Anderson that I almost forgot who Emma Carter was. The woman who stays late helping struggling students. The teacher who organizes poetry slams in the park. The person who chose this house because it felt like home, not because it met someone else's standards." Derek appeared beside us, His tie loosened, looking more relaxed than he had all evening. "I fell in love with Emma Carter," he said, having caught my last words. "Not some idealized Anderson wife. But I wanted so badly to belong," I admitted, turning to face him. "To be someone your mother could be proud of." "The irony," he replied, "is that you already belonged. You brought something to this family it desperately needed: authenticity. Look around." I did. The rigid seating arrangement had dissolved into natural groupings. My father was deep in conversation with Uncle William about community theater. Rachel was showing Cousin Charlotte photos of her graphic design work on her phone. Even Aunt Patricia, Linda's longtime ally in maintaining social standards, was admiring my mother's quilt with genuine interest. "I've been so focused on becoming what I thought an Anderson should be," I said slowly, "that I didn't see how much the Andersons needed to become a little more like the Carters." The realization hit me with the force of truth. My supposed failures to meet Anderson standards weren't failures at all. They were moments of authenticity breaking through the carefully maintained veneer of perfection. "You know what else I realize?" I continued, watching Linda show Catherine her old concert programs, which she'd apparently kept hidden all these years. "We've all been performing roles instead of living our lives. Linda playing the perfect society matriarch, Catherine hiding her passion for photography, me trying to reshape myself into someone else's idea of worthy." My mother squeezed my hand. "And now?" "Now I understand that belonging isn't about fitting into someone else's mold. It's about being brave enough to be yourself and giving others the courage to do the same." As if to underscore my words, the sound of piano music drifted from the house. Linda was playing again, this time accompanied by my father on his worn acoustic guitar. The combination should have been jarring: classical piano meeting casual, folk music, but somehow it worked. "I spent so much time thinking I needed to choose," I said, more to myself than to my listeners, "between being a teacher and being an Anderson wife, between my background and my married life, between who I am and who I thought I needed to become. But the real choice was simpler: between authenticity and performance." Derek wrapped an arm around my waist. "So who is Emma Anderson Carter going to be now?" The hyphenated name, something I'd never used before, suddenly felt right. Not because it represented a compromise, but because it acknowledged both parts of my identity. "Someone real," I answered. "A teacher who happens to be married into a prestigious family. A woman who values both tradition and innovation. Someone who can help bridge worlds instead of trying to abandon one for the other." The revelation settled over me like a comfortable blanket. All these years I'd been trying to cross a bridge by burning it behind me, when what I really needed to do was strengthen it, making it wide enough for traffic to flow both ways. From the house, Linda's piano and my father's guitar had found an unexpected harmony, just like our families were doing, I realized. Not through forced conformity, but through the courage to be authentic and the willingness to accept others' authenticity in return. My 30th birthday had indeed become a transformation, just not the one Linda had planned. Instead of becoming a proper Anderson wife, I had finally become fully myself. And in doing so, I'd helped others find their way back to themselves too. The impromptu musical collaboration between Linda and my father had drawn everyone back into the house. As I watched them play together, her classical training melding unexpectedly with his natural talent, I knew it was time for a decision that would either cement the evening's transformations or allow everything to slip back into old patterns. I picked up Linda's leather-bound book of traditions from where it had fallen, along with the portfolio containing my pre-written resignation letter. The weight of them in my hands felt like a choice between two futures, one prescribed and polished, the other undefined but authentic. "I need everyone's attention," I announced, my voice carrying over the final notes of the duet. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to me. Linda's hands stilled on the piano keys, uncertainty flickering across her face. These, I held up the items, represent everything we've been doing wrong. Not just me, not just Linda, but all of us. We've been letting a book of rules written by a woman none of us ever met dictate our lives, our choices, our relationships. I moved to the fireplace which we'd lit earlier when the evening air turned cool. So I'm making a decision. For myself, for my marriage, for our families. And I'm inviting all of you to make it with me. Derek stepped forward. Emma, wait, I said gently. This needs to be said. I turned to face Linda directly. You tried to give me what you thought was freedom tonight. Freedom from my career, from my identity, from everything that makes me who I am. But real freedom isn't about fitting into someone else's idea of perfect. It's about having the courage to be imperfect together. I opened the portfolio, removing the resignation letter. This letter represents every time we've chosen appearance over authenticity, every time we've silenced our own voices to meet someone else's expectations, every time we've made ourselves smaller to fit into a predetermined box. Moving to the fireplace, I held the letter over the flames. I'm choosing something different. I'm choosing to be a teacher who hosts charity galas, a woman who loves both classic literature and reality TV, someone who can serve fine wine in mismatched glasses and find beauty in both. The letter caught fire, curling into ash. I'm choosing to be Emma Anderson Carter, not one or the other, but both, all, everything I am. The room was absolutely still as I picked up the Book of Traditions. And this has been our prison. Not because traditions are bad, but because we've been using them as weapons instead of bridges. I looked at Linda. Would you like to help me write a new one? Linda rose from the piano bench, her eyes wide. What do you mean? A new book. New traditions. Ones that celebrate who we are instead of forcing us to be something we're not. One that says an Anderson wife can be a teacher, a photographer, a musician. Anything she dreams of being. I held out the old book to her. For a moment, she just stared at it, and I could see the battle playing out behind her eyes. Decades of conditioning fighting against the freedom she'd tasted at the piano. The music, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. When I was playing just now, with your father, I felt like myself for the first time in 30 years. She took the book from my hands, ran her fingers over its leather cover, one last time, then walked to the fireplace. Margaret told me that being an Anderson meant sacrificing who I was to become who I should be. She paused, looking around at the gathered faces. But watching you tonight, Emma, watching you refuse to make that sacrifice, I realized she was wrong. The book joined my resignation letter in the flames. Catherine stepped forward, camera in hand. Then let's start now. New traditions, new memories, new ways of being family. She held up her camera, starting with capturing genuine moments instead of posed perfection. The idea caught fire faster than the book had. Aunt Patricia kicked off her uncomfortable heels. Uncle William loosened his bow tie. My mother brought out more of her quilt squares, and this time, the Anderson women gathered around to actually learn the craft instead of just politely observing. The gift-giving ceremony, Linda said suddenly. We never finished it. Yes, we did, I replied softly. Look around. Everyone here is giving something real. Their true selves, their genuine interests, their authentic connections. That's worth more than any wrapped present. Derek took my hand, and I could feel the slight tremor in his grip. Emotion, not uncertainty. You know there's no going back from this, he said. No more perfect Anderson facade. Good, I said firmly. Perfect was never the goal. Real is so much better. We watched as Linda returned to the piano, this time inviting my father to teach her some of his folk songs. The sight of her, still elegant but no longer rigid, learning something new, something decidedly not Anderson appropriate, confirmed that I'd made the right choice. This was the true gift of my 30th birthday, not just finding my own voice, but helping others find theirs. Not just breaking free from expectations, but creating a new way of being family. Not just choosing between two worlds, but building a new one where both could exist together. The decision was made, the bridges were built, and the future, while uncertain, held the promise of something far more valuable than perfection. It held the promise of truth. As the evening settled into its new rhythm, support began emerging from unexpected corners. Aunt Patricia, who had always been Linda's staunchest ally in maintaining social standards, approached me carrying a small wrapped package she'd retrieved from her car. "I was going to give you this privately," she said, her voice low. "I didn't want Linda to know I had it." She pressed the package into my hands. "Open it now." Inside was a worn leather journal. Opening it, I found pages filled with elegant handwriting, recipes, notes, and what appeared to be poetry. "I don't understand," I said. "This belonged to Eleanor Anderson, Derek's great aunt, the one nobody talks about." Patricia's eyes darted around the room before continuing. "She was a published poet in the 1940s, writing under a pen name. Margaret, Linda's mother-in-law, never knew. Eleanor used to say that being an Anderson woman meant wearing two faces, one for the world and one for yourself." I ran my fingers over the yellowed pages. "Why are you showing me this now?" "Because watching you tonight reminded me of her. She was the only one who ever stood up to Margaret, though in secret. I've spent decades wondering what would have happened if she'd done it openly, like you did." She squeezed my arm. Maybe it's time her story came out too. Across the room, Catherine was organizing an impromptu photography session, not the formal portraits typical of Anderson gatherings, but candid shots capturing genuine moments. She caught Linda teaching my mother the proper piano posture, while my mother showed Linda how to relax her shoulders to better feel the music. "No," Catherine said, lowering her camera as I approached. "I've been getting calls about exhibition spaces. Real galleries, interested in my documentary work." She smiled. "I sent them some shots last week, after watching you stand your ground with Linda about your teaching career. You gave me courage I didn't know I needed." James, Derek's usually reserved brother, joined us. "I've been thinking," he said, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair, now slightly disheveled. "The Anderson Foundation, it's always focused on traditional charities, the ones that look good in society pages. But what if—" He glanced at me. "What if we started an education initiative, supporting teachers, funding arts programs, in public schools?" "Public schools?" Catherine's eyebrows rose. Linda's not the only Anderson anymore," James cut in. "And maybe it's time the foundation reflected all of us, not just one narrow vision of who we should be." My sister Rachel, who had been documenting the evening's events in her sketchbook, showed me her drawings. They captured the transformation from the rigid, formal gathering at the start to the current scene of genuine connection. The last sketch showed Linda and my father playing music together, their faces alive with shared joy. "You know what this reminds me of?" Rachel said, pointing to her sketch. "That time in high school when you organized that faculty talent show to save the arts program. Everyone said it would never work, mixing the stuffy academic types with the creative departments. But you made it happen." "She's always been good at bringing different worlds together," my mother added, joining us. "Even when she was little. Remember the neighborhood block party she organized? Got the fancy families from the Hill to mingle with everyone else?" Derek appeared with fresh glasses of champagne. "That's what drew me to you in the first place," he said, handing me a glass. "At that charity gala where we met, you were the only person there who seemed interested in actually talking to the scholarship students instead of just using them as photo opportunities. Linda's voice carried from the piano, where she was now attempting to learn one of my father's folk songs. "Emma, dear, come show me how to make this bridge between classical and folk work properly. Your father says you used to play both styles." As I moved to join them at the piano, I noticed Robert deep in conversation with my father. Their heads were bent over what looked like business cards, and I caught fragments about community orchestra and joint performances. The support flowing from all directions wasn't just about accepting me anymore. It was about everyone finding the courage to reveal their own hidden desires for change. Each person stepping forward seemed to inspire, another to share their own secret dreams, their own hopes for breaking free of rigid expectations. Uncle William, who had never shown interest in anything outside his banking career, was showing my mother photographs of the community theater productions he secretly attended. Cousin Charlotte admitted she'd been taking online courses in environmental science, despite her mother's insistence that society women didn't need scientific education. The evening had become more than just my birthday celebration, or even my stand against Linda's control. It had transformed into a sort of permission slip for everyone present. Permission to be authentic, to support each other's real dreams rather than prescribed ones, to build connections based on genuine interests rather than social obligations. As I sat between Linda and my father at the piano, helping them find harmony between their different musical styles, I realized that this was what true family support looked like. Not the orchestrated shows of unity the Andersons were famous for, but the messy, genuine effort to understand and celebrate each other's authentic selves. The old walls weren't just coming down, they were being replaced by bridges, built from the very differences we'd once tried to hide. As midnight approached, the party had evolved into something that would have been unrecognizable just hours before. The formal seating arrangement had completely dissolved, replaced by organic, groups engaged in genuine conversation. In one corner, Catherine had set up an impromptu gallery of her photographs on her laptop, showing a series documenting life in Seattle's diverse neighborhoods. "I've been thinking," she said as I joined her group, "about combining my photography with education somehow. Maybe workshops for underprivileged kids, teaching them to tell their stories through images." She glanced at me. "Would your school be interested in something like that?" Before I could respond, James stepped in. "The Anderson Foundation could fund it. A pilot program at Emma's school, then expand to others if it works." He turned to his wife. "You could finally use your talent to make real change, not just take photos at charity galas." Linda, who had been quietly observing nearby, surprised everyone by speaking up. "The Foundation's annual benefit is coming up next month." She smoothed her dress, a gesture I now recognized as nervous rather than fastidious. "Instead of the usual orchestra, perhaps we could showcase local artists. Catherine's photographs, Tom's folk music." She glanced at my father. "A true celebration of diverse talents." "And the guest list?" Aunt Patricia asked, a knowing edge to her voice. "Well," Linda straightened her shoulders, "I suppose it's time we expanded our definition of society beyond the country club set. Emma's work with underprivileged students has shown me there's more to community leadership than just writing checks at charity events." Derek's cousin Charlotte, who'd been typing furiously on her phone, looked up excitedly. "I've been texting with my study group, the one from my environmental science course. They work with inner-city gardens, teaching kids about sustainability. We could incorporate that too." The energy in the room shifted as people began building on these ideas. Robert and my father were discussing the possibility of joint performances between the community orchestra and professional musicians. Uncle William, emboldened by the evening's revelations, suggested using his banking connections to create a microfinance program for aspiring artists and educators. "It's like dominoes," Rachel murmured beside me. "One person speaks their truth, and it gives others permission to do the same." She was right. The careful facade of Anderson propriety hadn't just cracked, it had been replaced by something vibrant and real. People who had spent years making polite small talk at formal gatherings were now engaged in passionate discussions about art, education, community, and change. Linda approached me, holding Eleanor Anderson's journal that Aunt Patricia had shared earlier. "I knew her, you know," she said softly. "Eleanor. She used to play piano with me before." She trailed off, then squared her shoulders. "I've been thinking about the music program at your school. You mentioned budget cuts affecting arts education." I nodded, curious where this was going. "What if we established a permanent fund? The Eleanor Anderson Arts Initiative. Supporting not just music, but all forms of creative expression, especially for students who remind us of what we almost lost, our authentic voices." Derek joined us, wrapping an arm around my waist. "And the Anderson family archives?" he asked his mother. "All those traditions and protocols?" Linda's lips curved in a slight smile. "Perhaps it's time for a new archive, one that documents real achievements, not just social obligations. Catherine's photographs, Charlotte's environmental work, Emma's teaching successes." She paused. My return to music. The implications of that last statement hung in the air. Linda wasn't just suggesting changes to family traditions. She was committing to her own transformation. James appeared with fresh cups of coffee, not the expensive blend Linda had insisted on earlier, but the simple coffee my mother had brought. "We should meet next week," he said. "All of us. Start planning how to restructure the foundation to support these new initiatives." "And the old guard?" Robert asked, joining our group. "The other families who expect us to maintain certain standards?" "They can either join us in the 21st century or find other social circles to dominate," Linda declared, surprising. "Us all." I spent 30 years being the perfect Anderson wife. I think it's time to find out who Linda Anderson really is, and help other women avoid the trap I fell into. As if to underscore her words, the sound of piano music drifted through the room. My father had begun playing again, this time a melody that blended classical structure with folk sensibilities. Without hesitation, Linda joined him, adding harmonic complexity to his simple tune. The music they created together seemed to perfectly capture the evening's transformation, two different worlds finding unexpected harmony. "You know," Derek said softly in my ear, "when you told me you wanted to host your birthday party here, I was worried about exactly this kind of dramatic scene." I leaned into him, watching as more people gathered around the piano, some adding their voices, others simply swaying to the music. "Are you disappointed? Are you kidding?" He grinned. "My perfect, proper family is finally real. This is better than any society party could ever be." Looking around at the scene, Linda and my father creating new music together, Catherine documenting genuine moments instead of posed ones, James and Charlotte planning community initiatives instead of social events, I realized we weren't just changing direction. We were forging an entirely new path, one that honored both where we came from and who we truly were. The future stretched before us, no longer constrained by rigid traditions but open to endless possibilities. And it all began with the courage to be authentically ourselves. The first test of our newfound harmony arrived unexpectedly when the doorbell rang just past midnight. Margaret Anderson Jr., Linda's sister-in-law and self-appointed guardian of the family's social standing, swept into the room like a perfectly coiffed storm cloud. She had been conspicuously absent from the party, citing a prior engagement that everyone knew was fictional. "What on earth is going on here?" Her voice cut through the warm atmosphere like an icy wind. She took in the scene with obvious horror. Linda at the piano with my father, Catherine's documentary photos displayed on laptops, the mixed groups of Anderson elite and Carter relatives engaged in animated conversation. The music stopped abruptly. I watched the familiar tension creep back into Linda's shoulders as she rose from the piano bench. For a moment, the air crackled with possibility. Would she retreat into her old role, or stand firm in her newfound authenticity? "Margaret," Linda said, her voice steady but different from her usual social tone. "You've missed quite an evening." "Clearly," Margaret surveyed the room with barely concealed disdain. "I received several concerning messages about unusual activities here. I see they weren't exaggerated." Her gaze landed on the ashes of the family tradition book in the fireplace. "Linda, what have you done?" The room held its breath. This was Margaret Anderson, Jr., named after her formidable mother, keeper of social gates, wielder of significant influence in their circles. Her disapproval could have real consequences for the Anderson family's standing. "What I've done," Linda replied, moving to stand beside me, "is finally understand what my mother-in-law, your mother, stole from us. From all of us." Margaret's perfectly penciled eyebrows rose. "Excuse me?" "She made us believe that being an Anderson meant erasing ourselves. That tradition meant conformity. That social standing was worth more than personal fulfillment." Linda gestured around the room. "But look at what we've discovered tonight. Look at what happens when we stop performing and start living." "This is absurd," Margaret scoffed. "You're talking about dismantling generations of carefully maintained social order. And for what? So Catherine can play photographer? So Emma can continue her little teaching career?" "No." Catherine stepped forward, her camera still hanging around her neck. "So we can all be who we really are. So the next generation of Anderson women won't have to choose between their names and their dreams." Margaret turned to Robert, clearly expecting support from the family patriarch. "Surely you're not allowing this. This chaos?" Robert stood, straightening to his full height. "You know, Margaret, I've been thinking about your brother, my old friend Thomas. Remember how he loved to paint? Before your mother convinced him it wasn't suitable for an Anderson man?" "That was different." "Was it?" James interjected. "How many talents have we buried? How many dreams have we sacrificed for the sake of appearances?" Margaret's face flushed. "The Anderson name means something in this city. We have responsibilities, standards to maintain." "Yes, we do," I found myself speaking. "We have a responsibility to use our privilege and position to make real differences in our community, standards of authenticity, compassion, and genuine impact." "And who are you to define Anderson standards?" Margaret demanded, her voice sharp. "She's my wife," Derek stepped forward. "And she's done more to honor the true spirit of our family, name in one evening than all our society events combined." The room hummed with tension as Margaret looked around, seemingly realizing she was outnumbered. But she had one more card to play. "Linda," she said, her voice dangerously soft, "need I remind you of certain arrangements? The social committees you chair, the positions you hold, all of which depend on maintaining proper associations?" For a heartbeat, I saw fear flicker across Linda's face. These weren't idle threats. Margaret held significant influence over the social infrastructure Linda had spent decades building. But then Linda did something unprecedented. She laughed. "Oh, Margaret," she said, returning to the piano. "Would you like to know what I've discovered tonight? Those positions, those committees, they're just another cage. One we've gilded so carefully we forgot it was a prison." Her fingers touched the keys, and the opening notes of a complex classical piece filled the room. Without missing a beat, she transitioned into one of my father's folk melodies, blending the styles in a way that shouldn't have worked, but somehow did. "You can have the committees, Margaret. I found something better. Something real." As if to underscore her point, Catherine raised her camera and captured the moment, Margaret's shocked expression contrasting with Linda's serene focus on her music. "This is madness," Margaret declared, but her voice had lost its authority. "The family will hear about this. Good, Robert replied calmly. Let them hear. Let them see what the Andersons can become when we stop hiding behind social conventions and start living authentically. Margaret looked around one last time, seemingly searching for any ally in maintaining the old order. Finding none, she turned on her heel and left, the door closing behind her with a decisive click. The room remained silent for a moment after her departure, the weight of what had just happened settling over everyone. Then Linda's music swelled again, this time, joined by my father's guitar and several voices, creating something beautiful and unexpected, just like the evening itself. We had faced our first test, and instead of crumbling, we had grown stronger. The old power structures that had confined us were beginning to shift, making way for something new and authentic to emerge. As Margaret's dramatic exit settled into memory, a different kind of resistance began to emerge, more subtle but equally challenging. It started with a phone call that made Linda's face go pale. She excused herself to take it in the kitchen, but the raised voices carried clearly to those nearby. Cancel our annual donation? Linda's voice shook. But the Children's Hospital wing. We've supported it for decades. A pause. Yes, I understand that Margaret is on the board, but surely the needs of sick children outweigh social politics. I followed her into the kitchen, finding her gripping the counter for support. The phone lay silent on the marble surface, but its message echoed loudly. Change would have consequences beyond our family circle. They're pulling Anderson Foundation support from 3 major charities, Linda explained, her voice tight. Margaret's already contacted the board members. They're calling it a realignment of priorities, but the message is clear: fall back in line or watch decades of philanthropic work unravel. Before I could respond, James burst in, his own phone lighting up with messages. The country? Club board is calling an emergency meeting. Apparently, our family's membership is up for review. This isn't just about us anymore. They're targeting our business connections, our social networks, everything we've built. Derek joined us, his face grim. My firm just received a strongly worded email from one of our biggest clients, the Whitmore family. They're reconsidering their legal representation in light of recent events. The weight of these revelations settled heavily in the kitchen. This wasn't just about defying social conventions anymore. Real people's lives and livelihoods were at stake. Maybe we should, Linda began hesitantly. Perhaps we could find a compromise? Keep some of the old ways while slowly introducing changes? No, Catherine's voice rang out firmly. She stood in the doorway, camera still in hand. That's exactly what they want. To make us doubt ourselves, to force us back into our boxes through fear and manipulation. But the hospital wing, Linda protested weakly. The children who need... We'll have other supporters, I interrupted, an idea forming. Better ones, authentic ones. I turned to James. You mentioned earlier about restructuring the foundation. What if we did more than that? What if we completely reimagined how the Andersons contribute to this community? Robert appeared, having overheard our conversation. The Anderson name still carries weight, even without Margaret's social circles. We have other connections, other resources. More than that, Derek added, catching my vision. We have something they don't. Authenticity. Real passion for making change, not just making appearances. Charlotte rushed in, her phone displaying multiple text messages. The environmental group I've been working with? They're thrilled about potentially partnering with the Anderson Foundation. They say having our name attached to their cause could open doors they've never been able to reach. See? Catherine gestured excitedly. We don't need the old guard's approval. We can build something new, something better. But Linda still looked uncertain. Decades of social conditioning warring with her newfound freedom. The backlash will be severe. Margaret knows everyone who matters in this city. No, I said firmly. She knows everyone who matters in her world. But there's a whole city out there beyond country club gates and charity galas. Real people doing real work, making real change. My father, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. You know what made my community orchestra successful? Not fancy donors or social connections. It was passion, dedication, and actually connecting with our audience. People can tell the difference between authentic engagement and social obligation. The kitchen had become crowded as more family members joined the discussion. Aunt Patricia, surprisingly, was the next to speak. Eleanor Anderson, the one whose journal we found, she faced similar opposition when she wanted to publish her poetry. The family tried to silence her through the same tactics: social pressure, financial threats, personal attacks. And what did she do? Linda asked softly. She published anyway, under a pen name. Her work ended up helping fund women's education programs that the Anderson Foundation wouldn't support. She found a way to make change without permission from the gatekeepers. The energy in the room shifted as this story sank in. We weren't the first to face this kind of opposition, and we wouldn't be the last. But we had something our predecessors didn't: strength in numbers and a clear vision of what we were fighting for. So, James straightened his tie, business mode engaging. We have choices to make. We can retreat to our safe, controlled world of social obligations and empty gestures. Or, Catherine continued, we can push forward, knowing it won't be easy, but will be worth it. It's not just about us anymore, Derek added. It's about everyone who's ever felt pressured to conform, to suppress their authentic selves for the sake of appearances. Linda looked around at all of us, then down at her hands, pianist's hands that had been silent for too long. Margaret, we'll try to destroy everything we've built, she said quietly. Not just our social standing, but our ability to make any kind of impact in this community. Then we'll build something new, I replied. Something they can't destroy because it won't rely on their approval or support. The opposition we faced was more complex than we'd imagined, reaching into every aspect of our lives. But as we stood there in my kitchen, surrounded by family members both Anderson and Carter, I realized that we had something more powerful than social influence or financial leverage. We had truth, we had authenticity, and most importantly, we had each other. The next hour transformed my birthday party into something resembling a war room, albeit one with crystal champagne flutes and half-eaten cake. Laptops appeared on the dining room table, phones buzzed with messages and calls, and both families united in a way that would have seemed impossible just hours before. First, James announced, taking charge of the practical aspects, we need to secure our position before Margaret can do more damage. He looked up from his laptop. I've already contacted our family's legal team, not the firms, but our personal attorneys. They're drafting documents to protect the foundation's assets. Catherine, who had been rapidly typing on her phone, shared her screen with the group. My old contacts in photojournalism are already interested in the story. Not the scandal Margaret might try to create, but the real story, how one of Seattle's oldest families is evolving to meet modern challenges. That's great, Derek added, but we need more than just defense. We need to show what we're standing for, not just what we're standing against. I stood up, moving to the center of the room. My school's annual fundraiser is next month. Usually, it's a small affair, bake sales and raffles. But what if we made it something more? Not just raising money, but showcasing what happens when privilege meets purpose. Linda's eyes lit up. The hospital wing campaign. We could redirect it through different channels. Instead of the traditional donor dinner, we could organize something that actually connects with the community. A festival, my father suggested. Music, art, education, environmental awareness, everything we've talked about tonight. Show Seattle what the Anderson name really stands for. Robert nodded thoughtfully. We have the resources, the connections. We just need to use them differently. Aunt Patricia, who had been quietly making calls, looked up. I've reached out. to some of Eleanor's old literary circles. There's still a network of women who remember how she helped them. They're ready to support us. The energy in the room was electric as more ideas flowed. Charlotte's environmental group offered their venue, a restored urban garden space. Catherine's photographer friends volunteered to document everything. My teacher colleagues immediately began planning educational components. Then Linda did something remarkable. She walked to the piano, sat down, and began to play. Not the classical pieces expected of an Anderson wife, but a powerful, passionate composition that seemed to contain all her years of silent rebellion. "This is my stand," she announced, when she finished. "I'm giving a public concert, not at the country club, not at a charity gala, but at your school's fundraiser, Emma. Let Margaret try to dismiss that as unsuitable behavior." The room erupted in applause, but we were interrupted by another round of phones buzzing. Margaret had been busy. Social media was already filling with vague but pointed comments about family traditions and maintaining standards. "They're trying to control the narrative," Catherine observed, scrolling through her phone. "Make us look like rebels without a cause, troublemakers disrupting the social order." "Then let's give them a better story," I replied. "Not just rebellion, but renaissance. Not destruction, but evolution." Derek's phone rang, the managing partner of his law firm. He put it on speaker, his jaw set firmly. "Derek," the partner's voice was carefully neutral, "we've received some concerning calls about your family's situation. The Whitmores are particularly upset." "I understand," Derek replied calmly. "And I assume you've also noticed that the Anderson Foundation is one of the firm's largest clients?" A pause. "Yes, of course." "Then you should know that the foundation is undergoing an exciting transformation, one that will involve significant legal work in establishing new charitable initiatives, community partnerships, and corporate structures." Derek's voice was pure confidence. "The question is, will your firm be part of this evolution, or will you let social politics cost you one of your most valuable clients?" The partner's response was immediate. "Perhaps we should meet tomorrow to discuss these new initiatives in detail." After he hung up, Derek grinned. "They can pressure us individually, but together we're still a force to be reckoned with. We just need to redefine what that force stands for." Linda had been watching all this unfold, her expression moving from concern to determination. "Margaret always said an Anderson wife's duty was to maintain social harmony, but maybe true harmony comes from being brave enough to make necessary change." "Exactly," I agreed. "And we're not just standing our ground, we're claiming new territory, showing that social influence can be used for genuine good, not just maintaining appearances." James closed his laptop decisively. "The foundation. Meeting is on Monday. Instead of letting them question our choices, we'll present our new vision, not asking permission, but announcing direction." "And if they resist?" Linda asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Then we'll build something new," Robert replied. "The Anderson name doesn't belong to them. It belongs to all of us, and to what we choose to make of it." As the night deepened toward morning, we continued planning, strategizing, and supporting each other. Every attempt to shake our resolve only strengthened our determination. We weren't just defending a position, we were advancing a vision of what family, privilege, and social responsibility could really mean. The ground we stood on wasn't the shifting sand of social approval, but the solid foundation of authentic purpose and shared values. Let Margaret and her allies try to shake that. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows, our impromptu planning session evolved into concrete action. The dining room table had become command central, covered in laptops, notebooks, and empty coffee cups. What had started as a birthday party had transformed into the birth of something much more significant. "First steps," James announced, pulling up a spreadsheet he'd been working on. "We need to secure our independence before we can implement any changes. I've been analyzing the foundation structure, and there's something interesting. He turned his laptop so we could all see. The majority voting control actually rests with the direct Anderson line, meaning Dad, Derek, and me. Margaret's influence comes from social pressure, not legal authority. Linda, who had been making notes at the piano, looked up. The hospital? Wing campaign was my project originally. The board can't legally redirect those funds without my approval as committee chair. It was the development of a new model of social influence, one based on authentic engagement rather than artificial prestige. The Anderson name was evolving, and with it, our understanding of power, privilege, and purpose. The development phase wasn't just about what we were doing, it was about who we were becoming. The impact of our birthday party revolution began rippling through Seattle's social circles in unexpected ways. The first indication came from Melissa Chen, one of my students' mothers and a prominent food critic, who arrived at our house later that morning with coffee and pastries for our still planning group. "You have no idea what you've started," she announced, setting down the breakfast spread. My phone has been buzzing nonstop with people trying to understand what's happening with the Andersons. And not just the usual society gossips, real people, influential people who've been waiting for something like this. She pulled out her tablet, showing us social media discussions already forming around the Anderson family's transformation. See these hashtags? Authentic influence. New money culture. Social change, Seattle. They're all talking about you, but not in the way Margaret probably expected. Catherine's photos from the party had begun circulating. Not the posed, formal, shots typical of society events, but candid moments capturing real connection. Linda at the piano with my father, the mixed groups engaged in passionate discussion. The moment when I stood up to Margaret. "These images are powerful," Melissa continued. "They're showing people that change is possible, even in the most traditional circles." As if on cue, my principal called. He'd been contacted by 3 other private schools in the area, all interested in our upcoming fundraiser model. They're calling it the Anderson approach, using social influence to bridge community divides instead of reinforcing them. Linda, who had been quietly listening, suddenly straightened. "Melissa, you're connected to every major restaurant and venue in the city, aren't you?" Melissa nodded, curious. "The hospital wing campaign. We've been doing it wrong all these years. Instead of one big gala at the country club, what if we organized a citywide culinary festival? Local restaurants, food trucks, celebrity chefs, all raising money for children's health care?" Melissa's eyes lit up, breaking down the barriers between high-end dining and street food, just like you're breaking down social barriers. The culinary community would love it. And I can already think of several major sponsors who'd prefer this approach to another stuffy charity dinner. The external validation was coming from all directions. James received calls from other family foundations interested in our governance restructuring. Charlotte's environmental contacts reported increased interest from traditional donors who had previously dismissed their grassroots approach. Even the opposition was revealing unexpected support. Margaret's attempts to rally the old guard had exposed fractures in their unified front. Several prominent families, particularly their younger generations, had declined to support her campaign against us. "The Seattle Times wants to do a feature," Catherine announced, hanging up from a call. "Not about the society drama, but about the larger transformation. How traditional influence can adapt to modern social consciousness." Derek's law firm partners, sensing which way the wind was blowing, had completely reversed their position. Now they were eager to be seen as part of the progressive change in Seattle's social landscape. But the most interesting external perspective came from an unexpected source. Eleanor Anderson's literary circle had preserved more than just her memory. They had maintained a network of women who had quietly challenged social conventions for decades. "You're not the first to challenge the system," one of Eleanor's old friends told us over speakerphone. but you might be the first to actually change it? We worked from the shadows, using pen names and quiet influence. You're doing it openly, unapologetically. The validation from these hidden pioneers meant more than any society approval ever had. They saw our changes not as rebellion, but as evolution, the natural next step in their own long fight for authenticity. Local community leaders began reaching out, seeing opportunities for collaboration that had seemed impossible before. The director of a youth arts program in an underserved neighborhood shared how our story was inspiring her students. They're realizing that influence isn't just about money or social position, she explained. It's about having the courage to use whatever privilege you have to make real change. Even some of Linda's oldest society friends were quietly expressing support. We've all felt trapped by these expectations, one confided. Watching you break free, it's giving us permission to question things we've accepted for years. The external perspective was clear. What had started as a family drama had tapped into a deeper current of desired change. We weren't just reshaping the Anderson family. We were providing a template for how traditional influence could evolve to meet contemporary social needs. Melissa, who had been documenting the responses on her influential blog, summarized it perfectly. The Andersons aren't rejecting their privilege. They're redefining how privilege can serve community. They're showing that authenticity and influence aren't mutually exclusive. In fact, they're most powerful when combined. This outside validation strengthened our resolve. We weren't just fighting for our own freedom to be authentic. We were representing hope for change in circles far beyond our immediate family. The world was watching, and what they saw wasn't scandal or social rebellion. They saw the possibility of transformation, the power of choosing authenticity over appearance, purpose over protocol. 3 weeks after my birthday party, the ripple effects of our family's transformation began manifesting in ways none of us could have predicted. It started when Linda received an unexpected visitor at her regular Tuesday tennis club, the granddaughter of Margaret Anderson Sr., who had flown in from Boston after hearing about our revolution. I found these in my grandmother's private papers, Sarah Anderson Brooks said, laying out a collection of old letters on Linda's usual lunch table. Their correspondence between her and Eleanor, spanning decades. It seems the great family enforcer had her own doubts about the cage she'd built. The letters revealed a private struggle, Margaret Sr. questioning the rigid standards she imposed, watching her children and grandchildren sacrifice their dreams for social standing. In her final years, she'd written to Eleanor about her regrets, but had never found the courage to dismantle what she'd created. This revelation sent shockwaves through the extended Anderson network. Other families began coming forward with their own hidden histories of suppressed talents and abandoned passions. The Whitmore heir, who had initially threatened to pull business from Derek's firm, arrived at our door one evening. "My daughter," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "She wants to be a public defender. I've been pressuring her to join the family firm, just like my father did to me. But watching your family, maybe it's time to break the cycle." The ripples spread beyond the social elite. My school's fundraiser had evolved into a community-wide festival of arts, education, and environmental awareness. Local businesses that had never been invited to society events were now equal partners. In our initiatives, Catherine's photography exhibition, documenting our family's transformation, inspired similar projects across the city. Other photographers began capturing the contrast between social performance and authentic community engagement, creating a visual dialogue about privilege and purpose. Linda's music became a powerful symbol of liberation. Her first public performance, combining classical pieces with my father's folk arrangements, drew an unexpected audience. Society matrons sat beside local music students, traditional donors, next to community activists. "It's not just about the music," one of Linda's oldest friends confided after the performance. "It's about seeing someone we've known for decades finally become real. It makes us question our own performances." The Anderson Foundation's new direction sparked a revolution in Seattle's philanthropic community. Other family foundations began reviewing their structures, questioning whether their traditional approaches truly served their intended purpose. James's corporate law practice transformed as well. "I'm getting calls from next-generation inheritors," he reported during a family dinner. "They don't want to just maintain wealth. They want to redefine how it serves society. Our story showed them it's possible." Charlotte's environmental initiatives gained unprecedented support. Traditional donors who had dismissed climate concerns as too political were now engaging with community gardens and sustainability projects. The Anderson name, once synonymous with conservative tradition, became associated with progressive change. Even the resistance had unexpected effects. Margaret's attempts to maintain social barriers highlighted their artificiality, pushing more families to question long-held conventions. Several country club board members resigned in protest of the review of our membership, starting their own inclusive social organizations. The ripples reached my classroom in profound ways. Students from privileged backgrounds began engaging differently with their peers, inspired by our family's example of authentic connection across social divides. Parents who had previously focused solely on academic achievement started asking about community engagement opportunities. Rachel's graphic design firm saw an influx of clients wanting to rebrand their family legacies. "They're all talking about authenticity now," she said. "Your birthday party somehow gave permission for old money to develop a conscience." The Anderson Women's Luncheon, traditionally a showcase of social competition, transformed into a forum for meaningful dialogue. Women shared stories of deferred dreams and rediscovered passions. Linda's piano playing became a regular feature, inspiring others to share their hidden talents. Robert's business connections shifted focus. Instead of just measuring profit, they began discussing social impact and community responsibility. The Anderson name now opened doors for environmental activists and education advocates, not just social climbers. Perhaps the most significant ripple was the change in family dynamics. Across Seattle's influential circles, parents began attending their children's art shows and poetry readings instead of pushing them toward suitable careers. Family gatherings became celebrations of individual passions rather than performances of social status. "You've started something bigger than us," Derek's cousin Charlotte observed at a community garden event. "It's like everyone was waiting for permission to be real, and somehow your birthday party gave it to them." The ripple effects weren't just changing what people did. They were changing how people thought about influence, privilege, and purpose. Each small wave of transformation encouraged others to create their own ripples, building momentum for genuine social change. What had started as one family's revolution was becoming a blueprint for how traditional influence could evolve to meet contemporary needs. The Anderson name now stood for something more valuable than social status. It represented the courage to choose authenticity over appearance, purpose over protocol, and genuine impact over social performance. A month after my birthday party, Linda hosted a different kind of family gathering at her home. The formal dining room, once reserved for carefully orchestrated society dinners, now held a casual mix of Andersons and Carters, gathered around a table laden with both gourmet dishes and home-cooked comfort food. "I think it's time we addressed the elephant in the room," Linda began, setting down her wine glass. "Margaret has called a full family council for next week, all Anderson branches, extended family included. She's presenting it as a chance to heal divisions, but we know it's really a final attempt to restore the old order." The news hung in the air, but it didn't carry the weight it might have a month ago. We'd grown stronger in our new reality, more confident in our chosen path. "Let her try," Catherine said, reviewing recent photos on her camera. "Look at what we've built." She projected images onto the living room wall, Linda performing at community centers, James working with grassroots organizations, Charlotte's environmental projects thriving. "It's not just about defying the old ways anymore," Derek added. "We've created something worth defending. Something real. Robert cleared his throat. I spoke with Margaret yesterday. She offered a compromise. We can keep our personal projects if we maintain certain traditional appearances. Keep up the social facade while doing our community. Work quietly. Like Eleanor did? I asked, thinking of her secret poetry career. Exactly, Linda replied. But that's the old way, hiding authenticity behind social performance. We've moved beyond that. James pulled out his laptop, showing the Foundation's recent impact reports. Our new initiatives have reached more people in 1 month than traditional galas did in a year. Real impact, measurable change. And the social costs? Linda asked, softly. The connections we've lost, the doors that have closed. My father, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. Seems to me you've gained more than you've lost. New connections, different doors, maybe better ones. Rachel nodded, pulling up her design portfolio. Look at these rebranding projects. Every family foundation in Seattle wants to follow the Guy Anderson model of authentic engagement. You're not losing influence, you're redefining it. The conversation shifted to practical matters. How would we present our case at the family council? What evidence would we show of our new approach's success? I said slowly, we're looking at this wrong. This isn't about defending our choices or proving our worth. It's about inviting others to join us in something better. Derek squeezed my hand. Emma's right. We're not rebels anymore. We're leaders. The question isn't whether we'll maintain the Anderson legacy, but how we'll guide it into the future. Linda moved to her piano, running her fingers lightly over the keys. You know, Margaret Sr. wrote something interesting in those letters to Eleanor. She said her greatest regret was creating a system that valued appearance over purpose. She saw the cage she'd built but didn't know how to dismantle it. Maybe that's our real role, Catherine suggested. Not just breaking free ourselves, but showing others how to do it too. The discussion continued into the evening, but it wasn't tense or fearful. Instead, there was a sense of purpose, of clarity about who we were and what we stood for. I've been thinking about my mother, Linda said as we gathered in the kitchen for coffee. How she gave up her dreams of being a concert pianist to become the perfect society wife. I spent years doing the same thing to myself, then tried to force that pattern on you, Emma. She paused, emotion catching in her throat. But watching you stand your ground at your birthday party, it didn't just free you. It freed all of us, showed us another way to be influential, to make a difference. Robert joined us, wrapping an arm around his wife's shoulders. The family council can't touch that. They can challenge our methods, question our choices, but they can't undo the authenticity we've found. As if to prove his point, the doorbell rang. To everyone's surprise, it was Margaret herself, looking less commanding than usual. She hesitated. I thought perhaps we could talk. Before the council. See if there's a way to preserve what matters without losing what you've built. Linda welcomed her sister-in-law inside, leading her to the informal family gathering. Margaret took in the scene, the mixed groups, the casual atmosphere, the genuine connections. This isn't what I expected, she admitted, watching my father and Robert discuss community orchestra plans. When I heard about your birthday party rebellion, I thought it was about rejecting our heritage. But this is something else, isn't it? It's about making that heritage mean something real, I replied. About using influence for purpose, not just performance. The resolution we'd been seeking wasn't about winning a power struggle or proving our point. It was about transforming opposition into understanding, resistance into growth. As Margaret settled into a chair, accepting a plate of mixed cuisines and joining our open discussion, we realized that true resolution wasn't about choosing sides. It was about creating space for everyone to find their authentic voice and purpose. The Anderson legacy wasn't ending. It was evolving, becoming something stronger and more meaningful than social performance could ever be. One year after the birthday party that changed everything, we gathered again in our backyard. This time there was no careful orchestration, no social performance, no hidden tensions. The space had been transformed not just by the casual mix of furniture and decor, but by the authentic joy that filled it. Linda sat at a piano we'd moved outdoors for the occasion, playing a piece she'd composed herself, a melody that wove together classical training and folk influences, much like our families had woven together two different worlds. My father accompanied her on guitar, their music symbolizing the harmony we'd found. "I never imagined this," Linda said during a break, watching her society friends mingle comfortably with local activists and community leaders. "I spent so many years afraid of losing what we had, I couldn't see what we might gain." Catherine's latest photography exhibition, displayed along the garden walls, told the story of our year of transformation. Images showed Linda teaching piano at community centers, James working with grassroots organizations, and Charlotte's environmental projects flourishing in unexpected places. "Look at this one," Derek said, pointing to a particular photograph. It showed Margaret, who had become an unexpected ally, reading Eleanor's poetry to a group of young women at a leadership workshop. "Who would have thought your birthday rebellion would inspire her to become a champion for authentic influence?" The Anderson Foundation's annual report, which James had brought to share, showed the tangible impact of our changes. Community. Engagement had tripled while administrative costs had halved. Real change was happening, not just social performance. "You know what I understand now?" I said, watching the diverse group of people who had become our extended family. That night, when I thought I was fighting for acceptance into the Anderson world, I was actually fighting for something much bigger. The right to be authentic. Not just for myself, but for everyone. Robert nodded, joining our conversation. The old guard thought we were destroying tradition. They couldn't see we were making it meaningful again, giving it purpose beyond social status. The children playing in the garden, a mix of Anderson heirs and students from my school, embodied the world we were building. They moved freely, between groups, unconcerned with social barriers that had once seemed impenetrable. The real gift, Linda reflected, wasn't just breaking free from social constraints. It was discovering that influence is most powerful when it's authentic, when it serves something beyond appearances. My mother, who had been quietly observing, added her perspective. "You Andersons thought you were learning from us about being real, but we Carters learned something too, about using privilege responsibly, about making change from within systems, about building bridges instead of walls." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the garden as Catherine gathered everyone for a group photo. Unlike the posed portraits of the past, this one captured genuine moments. Linda and my father at the piano, Margaret sharing Eleanor's journal with young activists, children from different backgrounds playing together. "This is the real Anderson legacy," Derek said, watching the scene. "Not the maintenance of social barriers, but the courage to break them down. Not the performance of influence, but its authentic use for good." Rachel, who had been documenting our journey through her art, unveiled a series of sketches that captured our transformation. The first showed the rigid separation at my birthday party. The last depicted the current scene of genuine connection and purpose. "You know what's really amazing?" Charlotte observed, looking at the sketches. "We didn't just change ourselves. We created a template for other families, other institutions to follow, showing that tradition and progress can coexist, that influence can serve authenticity." As the evening drew to a close, Linda called everyone's attention. She sat at the piano one last time, but instead of playing alone, she invited others to join. My father with his guitar, local musicians we'd met through community projects, even beginning students from her new teaching program. The music they created wasn't perfect by classical standards, but it held something more valuable, the sound of genuine collaboration, of barriers broken down, of authentic expression. A year ago, Linda said when the music ended, I tried to give Emma a gift that would have caged her authentic self. Instead, she gave all of us the gift of freedom. Freedom to be real, to be purposeful, to be truly influential. Looking around at this gathering, so different from the tense celebration of a year ago, I finally understood the full meaning of that birthday party. It wasn't just about refusing to be changed by the Anderson name. It was about changing what that name meant, transforming it from a symbol of social status to a force for authentic good. The legacy we were building wasn't constrained by social expectations or traditional protocols. It was as expansive as our courage to be real, as strong as our commitment to purpose, as lasting as our determination to use influence for meaningful change. The true gift of my 30th birthday hadn't been acceptance into the Anderson family. It had been the transformation of what family, influence, and legacy could mean. Not just for us, but for everyone brave enough to choose authenticity over appearance, purpose over protocol, and real impact over social performance. As the stars began to appear above our garden, they shone on something new. A family defined not by its social standing, but by its commitment to authentic purpose. A legacy built not on maintaining barriers, but on breaking them down. A future shaped not by fear of change, but by the courage to lead it.